This is ICUJP for Friday morning, September 20th. Very early Friday morning, as some people have pointed out, but um, hey, that's what we do. And my name's Rick, and I'm the facilitator for today. And I'm also the communications and social media person for the group. And very, very happy to see you all today. I will post in the chat again our ICJP link tree. And it's a really good resource because it tells you not only, it'll take you directly to our website. Um, it'll show you some of the stuff that some of our speakers have been working on over the years, things like books that they've written. Um, uh, Films that they have directed or written for. Some of the partners that we are working with, like the AFSC, Apartheid Free Communities, the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign, our YouTube channel, which in a few, maybe next week or a week after this program will be featured on. Um, and also, you can donate to ICUJP from there. And you can get a lovely ICUJP t-shirt if you want. There's even a playlist on there featuring some jazz, R&B, social justice type of music. So it's a really good thing to play. I found it's a really good weekend soundtrack. So if you can take a look there, but also if you can take a look at maybe donating to ICUJP. We've been doing this. This is our 23rd year. We started after September 11th, 2001, when a lot of really great people got together uh, with the idea of founding an organization that frankly believes religious communities should not be blessing war and violence. It's a strong statement, and it's still a controversial and powerful statement. And I think just the simplicity of it is one of the reasons why we've been around for that long. And along with Father Chris is one of the people that was at that table at the beginning. We also have um, Reverend George Regas, Reverend Jim Lawson, Dr. Maher Hathout, um, uh, and Rabbi Leonard Bierman. All of them had a hand in and were one of the um, great instigators of this program. We had been doing this work online, especially after the COVID pandemic. But now that it's relatively better to go out, we've been doing more programs out in the real world. We did one at home in the United Methodist Church 2 years ago. And we're asking you to donate, and you can go to the link tree and do that there to help with the programs that we are doing in the real world as well, because there are things like facility costs, there are things like printing up programs and printing up things for people to take home. Those are all costs that are incurred that happen with that. So anything that you can do to help out with that would be great. So we have a reflection from Rebecca Arvizu. So Rebecca, if you can, uh, the
Yeah,
floor is
let
yours.
me bring up my timer here. Hmm, Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to be reading from The Covenant with Black America 20 Years Later. It's a book compiled and edited by Tavis Smiley. It's an update to a book that he released 20 years ago with a collection of essays after Hurricane Katrina, where he saw Black people receiving inequitable treatment and resources. So one, so the contributors to this new book include um, Reverend John Barber from the Poor People's Campaign, as well as Cornel West and Melina Abdullah. Cornel West is running for president right now as the Justice for All. ticket, and his running mate is Melina Abdullah, who's the co-founder of Black Lives Matter. And another contributor is Tyrone Howard. He wrote an essay on education, and I listened to Tyrone's radio show on Saturday mornings from 10 to 11 a.m. on KBLA because we both went to school in Compton together. So I relate to a lot of what he says about education. He is the Pritzker Family Endowed Professor of Education in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. So his essay is entitled Establishing a System of Public Education in which all children achieve at high levels and reach their full potential. He writes, education in the United States continues to be one of the most cherished commodities, with the promise of upward mobility, equal opportunity, and social and economic inclusion. Education purports to break down barriers across racial, gender, and social class lines. As a nation, we have been conditioned to believe that access to high quality education is the proverbial equalizer. Millions the world over have sought to come to these United States to experience a multitude of promised freedoms and opportunities. And one of the key promises has been the pathway to education opportunity, which has been denied in many parts of the world. What is often missing from our narrative about the availability of high quality, free public education has been that the quest to equal education opportunity has been hindered by the persistence of individual and institutional racism that has plagued the nation's non-white citizens. Often referred to as America's original sin, racism has always been weaponized in the US to create two-tiered systems of haves and have-nots. And no place has that been more prevalent than in the nation's schools. Dating back to the advent of Indian boarding schools, the denial of education to enslaved Africans, to the creation of separate but unequal schools, the nexus of race and equal education opportunity has been a complicated, complex, and contradictory set of entanglements. The point that can't be denied is that America's darkest hued citizens have always been on the outside looking in when it comes to the quest for equal education opportunity. Thus, what does it mean in the current moment of 2024 as we embark on the 70-year anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, that equal education remains a dream for many? What it means is that we need educational equity now. Providing equal education will only reinforce existing inequities. Equality is our goal. Equity is a process that we must use to get there. Equity now is centered on the idea that there needs to be a fundamental shift in how to provide more commitments, resources, and persistent investments into those groups and communities that have historically been excluded from educational opportunities. The landmark anniversary of Brown as a promise of equal education occurs at a time when the majority of the nation's student populations are majority non-white, and the number will only grow in the years to come. Some demographers estimate by the year 2042, the US will be a nation that will be majority minority. So how does America ensure its status as a world power and beacon of democracy when the majority of its citizens continue to attend schools where they are overlooked, undervalued, and underserved? Consider the fact that the most recent data from the US Department of Education asserts that as the US becomes more diverse, the challenges that it faces are becoming more entrenched politically. The attacks on critical race theory, the elimination of DEI-related efforts, the banning of books, and the undermining of Black studies and other ethnic study curriculums all reveal an all-out assault on creating a more diverse and inclusive curriculum in today's schools. We are witnessing a politicizing of America's public schools that we have not seen in decades. By using fear, misinformation, and polarization to attack the diversification of the nation, Those on the right have left us at a pivotal crossroads where education is concerned. Do we revert back to hyper segregated schools that are inherently unequal and cater to those with power and privilege? Or do we respond in a more belonging and truth telling approach to education that brings people together in the quest to create a more perfect United States? To that end, the nation has to ask if its commitment to education equality is real or only hollow platitudes. In order for the nation to attain education equity now, there are a number of steps that can be taken to address even uneven educational opportunities. He proposes 5 commitments: racial reckoning on the state of America's schools, commitment to high quality teachers, elimination of school discipline policies, getting real about poverty, and understanding the impacts of COVID-19. So if you want to learn more about the plan, check out the book, The Covenant with Black America 20 Years Later.
That's really good. Thank you very much. There's a lot to unpack in there, and usually about this time of year, like the last couple of years, we've done a program on education, at least one. So maybe that's something we need to revisit, and we have a couple open dates in October. If any of you would like to join us next week, and I hope you do, we're going to have a talk from Apanyi Lockhart, who's working on the Proposition 6 in California, which helps eliminate that constitutional provision that allows involuntary servitude for incarcerated persons. So I think a lot of us don't have a really an idea in depth of how much the how much our capitalist society depends on the involuntary servitude of people in that are incarcerated, and it shouldn't be happening. We should probably be looking at, and part of what we're going to be talking about is boycotting a lot of the companies that do that kind of thing. So, yeah, if you can join us next week for that, that would be great. One of the reasons that we wanted to do this program was because there is a growing understanding and a growing misunderstanding about the whole realm of neurodiverse people. And I think everybody on this call probably, if they're not affected by somebody in their family or a friend, probably knows somebody that is on the spectrum. This kind of hits me personally because my niece is on the spectrum. I'm and it's one of those things where you probably know a lot of people that if they were to be diagnosed, they would be considered on the spectrum, but probably went under the radar, like my late brother that had learning difficulties and just a difficult life growing up. And it's something that learning how to communicate with other people, no matter whether and how you learn their language and how you learn another language to speak to somebody is something intrinsically important to human nature, whether that takes the shape of trying to learn sign language or learning another verbal language or learning what somebody's trying to tell you when you have to really search for what they're trying to say to you is something that grows us all. So that's one of the things that we wanted to talk about. Also, one of the things that brought me to invite our speaker, our first speaker, Todd Boss, was a children's book he wrote called The Boy Who Said Wow. And for those of you who got the invite, you probably saw the story in there about a little kid named Ronan, pretty much nonverbal, who went to a classical music concert. And this was a meme a few years ago. You hear the music come down, and then in the audience, you hear just this heartfelt wow of just being overwhelmed by what was happening. And it was so heartfelt that all these, you know, kind of that they can be stuffy classical people just saw it as something uh, beautiful. The organization reached out to all of, who they could, and they found out that it was Ronan. And at that point, before that, he was pretty much nonverbal. Todd's book is a really great story about that. And his work with poetry is something that we wanted to really take a look at as well, and let you know that this kind of stuff, this kind of uh, finding a metaphor for your life through work in the arts is something that can help everybody, I think, and help you find out who you are. And down underneath all the programming, you find out about how your hard drive works. And that's very important for all of us to learn about. So I hope I did not mess up Todd's introduction here, but you know, he's not only is he doing this work in poetry and with the book writing, but he's a pretty active guy. So I'll let you, Todd, I'll let you take over and uh, talk to us about what you're doing. If everybody else can go on mute, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. It's a pleasure to be here. You've done a good job of summarizing what happened that day 5 years ago when Ronan's grandfather took a risk and brought him to Orchestra Hall, Symphony Hall in Boston. Um, it's like you said, not just that Ronan had so guilelessly voiced what so many of us feel when in the rapturous throes of a perfect composition's final chords. And it's not just that he had inadvertently spoken for the crowd. It turns out that he's so far along the nonverbal spectrum that his parents didn't even know he knew the word wow. Nobody had ever heard him use it before. For all we know, it was Ronan's first wow. Uh, for all we know, at that moment, a new neural pathway had been forged in Ronan's brain that evening. And if you haven't heard it yet, I do encourage you all to call up the CBS News story, among many, and give it a listen. It's filled with rapturous wonder, uh, as Rick said. I've got a few stories to tell you today. But I'll start by giving you a little background. My own childhood was not easy. I grew up on a farm in west central Wisconsin. Uh, Farm life was tough for my parents and me. Many of us have romantic ideas about what farm life entails, but in truth, my family's farm broke all of our hearts over and over again. One tragedy after another befell our little acreage, and we did a lot of backbreaking damage control, and it never seemed to end. My parents spent long nights at the kitchen table, agonizing over an adding machine and their to-do lists, trying to sort it all out. My mother was the expressive one. My father spoke very little, and he never shared an emotion from German Norwegian heritage. But that changed one summer night when my mother reached for her dog-eared copy of the best-loved poems of the American people. and she read a poem or two into the night air, rich with the sound of crickets singing through the windows. And I sat listening in the other room. And I'll never forget my father breaking into tears, the first time I had ever seen him cry, when she read this simple little poem, Tragedy, by Jill Sparger. I don't know how many of you know it. It is in the best loved poems, but it's not very well known. I'll put it in the chat so you can follow along. It's a simple little poem. I always wanted a red balloon. It only cost a dime. But Ma said it was risky. They broke so quickly. And besides, she didn't have time. And even if she did, she didn't think they were worth a dime. We lived on a farm, and I only went to one circus and fair, and all the balloons I ever saw were there. There were yellow ones and blue ones, but the kind I liked the best were red, and I don't see why she couldn't have stopped and said that maybe I could have one, but she didn't. I suppose that now you can buy them anywheres, and that they still sell red ones at circuses and fairs. I got a little money saved. I got a lot of time. I got no one to tell me how to spend my dime. Plenty of balloons, but somehow there's something died inside of me, and I don't want one now. The poem is very plain spoken, and it doesn't end in any epiphanies or eloquent insights. And yet, seeing my father transformed by it was a very powerful experience for me. It may have changed my life forever. I told you I had a few stories for you this morning, maybe only two additional beyond Ronan's. And I'm not finished telling you about Ronan, but first I want to tell you about Connie. It took me 15 years after I graduated with a master's degree in poetry to have any success as a poet. But I began finally to sell my poems to important journals, and editors were starting to take notice. And eventually I signed with W. Norton for my debut collection. And with all that success, I got a little bit cocky, and I mounted a website for myself and my work. That's not unusual, but what made it unusual is that it included a page inviting strangers to hire me to write a poem for them on commission. It was unorthodox. I had never heard of any other poet doing this. Street corner poets will write you a poem on a manual typewriter on the spot for $5. That's not what I was after. I wanted deep engagement, resulting in a great work of art that would do honor to my profession and stand as a monument in the life of my client. In retrospect, I think I may have been trying to evoke my father's tears again in other people. And to my surprise, within a few months of posting that webpage, I had my first client. A woman named Connie contacted me from Berkeley, California. Connie wanted me to write a poem of appreciation that she could present to her friend, Rosie, on her 80th birthday. Rosie had been a mentor, a confidant, and a mother figure to Connie for more than 40 years, and she was dying of complications from Parkinson's disease. And I almost said no. My doubts and fears were prevalent for me. I didn't know if she was calling my bluff. Was I really ready to commit to a custom poetry project like this? I'd never done anything like it before. I had every reason to decline. I had never been to Berkeley. I had no experience of Parkinson's disease. I was barely 40 years old myself and had never had a lifelong mentor like this woman had. I was not confident I could write a poem from a woman's point of view, a tribute to another woman. But I wrote up a simple contract that allowed me to exit the agreement for any reason. And then I interviewed her for an hour by phone. And it went so well that I agreed to interview her for another hour and then for a third. The interviews were fascinating. Connie was a psychotherapist herself. She and Rosie had traveled a spiritual road that had landed them in the Episcopalian tradition, where they celebrated Easter together every year without fail, no matter if They were on opposite sides of the continent. They'd been in one another's weddings and helped each other through divorces. At one point, Connie described Rosie as a woman with aristocratic tastes who became a woman of the people, teaching at a community college. And I wondered how I would ever find the right metaphor, the right image to capture the essence of that dichotomy. Months went by and no poem came. My doubts and fears appeared justified, and I prepared to abandon the project. One weekend, I drove to a remote cabin to give Connie's poem one last shot. I arrived in the evening. I spent most of the night with the windows open to the sound of waves lapping on the lakeshore, and tried my best to write Connie's poem, but still nothing came. And I went to bed confident that writing poems for strangers was not for me. The next morning, on my way to town to get groceries, I got a shock. An albino deer stepped out of the woods into the roadway in front of me. I had never seen one before. All white, pure elegance. And I realized in that instant that I was looking at Connie's poem. I'm going to put this in the chat as well so you can read this with me too. Oops, I don't know why this isn't working for me. All right, well, it doesn't look like it's sending for some reason, so I'll just read it to you. It's called A Deer. It seems to me to be, again, as if our 40 years were no more than a dream. This morning, driving in the steam of dawn in an autumn woods, I happened upon a yearling deer that was, unlike her tawny sisters, a brilliant white. All white and white and white she was, a great astonishment of white. Her body a flag, a flame of snow in the bower. She was a glow, a ghost in the mist around her. And oh, my dear, how I wished you were there. She trembled so to see me slow to the gravel and halt. I had to wait her out. So filled with praise was I, my heart. What grace, what art, what eloquence she bore. Though no less and no more a deer than any deer in the forest, still it seemed these trees were holier for her being there in the recitative of a leafing breeze. I wanted eternity with her, but I was not her owner. And soon, with a jolt, like a joyful spirit, she bolted over, joining the plainer flock that waited invisibly on the other side, like a bride. And with her into the ether danced my pride in having even briefly known her. When I read that poem to Connie over the phone that afternoon, we wept together, both our hearts blended, united in poetry. And when I hung up, the world seemed a very different place. So by the time 15 years later, I heard Ronan's wow story on the radio, I had no more doubts about my ability to write from the point of view of a stranger, having written 9 more poems on commission during that time. And I was undaunted by the age difference or the nonverbal disability that stood between us. I called the orchestra, who put me in touch with the family, and I interviewed everyone I could reach. And by that time, Ronan's wow had gone viral, circling the globe in news story after news story. And I heard about it on public radio. I had never written a children's book before, but even though the story had touched millions of adults, I felt it belonged in the hands of children. So I boiled the story down to the simplest retelling, turning it into something of a spare elegant children's poem. I did not bother to explain Ronan's disability. I simply recounted his experience as best I could from his perspective, painting him merely as a quiet child who, at the end of the day, had only one thing to say. I think this distinction is important, so I'm going to dwell on it for a minute. I repeat, nowhere in the book do I call Ronan autistic or attempt to explain what makes him differently abled. Instead, I refer to him throughout the book simply as quiet, and I let the reader assume what they wish. Midway through the book, after Ronan has been quiet for many pages, I write, "Some kids are born noisy, others are born quiet. Some days Ronan hardly says a word. What goes on in his mind, do you suppose? Only Ronan knows." And by painting Ronan simply as an inward-looking person, my hope was to invite the reader to admire and wonder at and imagine his perspective, which is to say, I invite them to empathize. We all have a story to tell, whether we're trained to articulate it or not, whether we are literate or verbal or not, whether we are able to access the words or not. We all have a story. And I've come to believe that all our stories can be transformed into poetry. When I sold The Boy Who Said Wow to Simon & Schuster, my girlfriend and I celebrated by spending the day walking Santa Monica. We often did. That's where she lived at the time. It's such a beautiful place to walk with the ocean breeze coming in. We always fell deep in conversation on those walks. And that day we traced the crooked path through my varied poetry practice from Connie all the way to Ronan, when suddenly she stopped mid-stride. That's what happens to her when she gets a great idea. She just freezes. And she said, "That would make an amazing podcast." And immediately I recognized that she was right. A podcast could provide a platform that could serve to demonstrate both the difficulty and the rewards of working with strangers to write transformative poetry that articulates the magic and mystery and music deep within their stories. So by the time The Boy Who Said Wow was published, I had launched it. The podcast is available now on all the streaming platforms. It's called There's a Poem in That. Every episode ends in happy tears. On one episode, for example, a singer in Long Island gets a poem reconciling her with the loss of her voice. In another episode, a farmer in rural Washington gets a poem of recovery from her 18-month-old's crib death. In another episode, a Mexican immigrant in Las Vegas named Philip gets a poem celebrating his new US citizenship. This work has been so rewarding that I hope to do it for the rest of my life. And I believe in it so strongly that I've begun to recruit other poets to work in this modality by making them guest writers on the show. Philip's poem, for example, celebrating his citizenship, wasn't written by me, but by guest poet Richard Blanco. Blanco famously read a poem for Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009, a Cuban American who once wrote and delivered a poem for millions from the steps of the US Capitol. But when he guested on There's a Poem in That and wrote and delivered a poem for just one person, he called it one of the most rewarding experiences of his career. And when he read it to Philip, Philip cried so hard he couldn't speak. It's not just that he was at a loss for words. Philip told me later that he felt seen and heard and understood. The episode just closes over the quiet sound of his uncontrollable sobbing. I'm not trained as a therapist. I'm quick to point that out to clients I work with, and yet what I do is clearly therapeutic. I've come to think of this practice as the application of a kind of literary medicine to people who need it. The poems I write for clients often get printed and framed and hung on their walls in places of prominence in their homes. And many have been memorized, and several have been read at funerals and weddings. One client told me her poem was the answer to a prayer. Another called it magical. They carry the printouts in their journals with them for years afterwards. They call it one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. So when you invited me to speak, I heard all those doubtful voices. I'm only an artist. I am not a diplomat. I don't know much about peace and justice in the world. But I began to give it some thought. What factors need to be addressed in order for a society to be just and peaceful? It's obviously a big topic. Competent democracy is helpful, good international relations, and the people themselves need to be healthy. Here in this country, we are not healthy. Estimates are that 1 in 5 American adults, 40 million of us, are experiencing mental illness every year. So the podcast is basically a free clinic available to anyone who wishes to walk through the door. And in fact, I've been using the term clinical poetry to describe what I do. I have a friend at the University of Minnesota Medical School, Dr. John Hallberg, who says, he agrees. He says that by clinical poet, you can mean that Todd is not writing poetry for an assumed audience, but for a real world one. He borrows from the language of translational medical science to say that this takes me out of theoretical or laboratory methodologies and into the exam room where it comes face to face with actual client need. When we're young, we're told not to talk to strangers, and as adults, we're never told any differently. So we continue to act like children towards strangers, not talking to them long after we're grown up. And then we wonder why we've grown up into such a cold, distant world full of people who are wary of us, as wary of us as we are of them. We're all awash in misinformation and disinformation and deep fakes and largely vacuous public discourse in this sort of meme-driven social media environment. And it's no wonder we're anxious and disoriented and suspicious of one another. Ronan is not the only one who could be described as living in a world of his own. We're all suffering, by and large, from a deficit of meaningful interactions. I call it PMM, pervasive modern meaninglessness, is a term I've coined to summarize this rapidly compounding feeling that the world makes no cohesive sense. It's disabling. I'm not here to announce that poetry is the antidote to all of that or claim that my little podcast is the solution to all the world's problems, but I'm learning that poetry is medicine and that it's capable of transforming our worst stories about ourselves, our doubts, and our fears into expressions of growth and wonder and joy. I don't believe peace and justice are possible in a world where the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves focus on our incapabilities, our limitations, and our disabilities. I'm learning to transform those stories into stories of ability. The attentive look in Ronan's eyes when he opens his copy of The Boy Who Said Wow. The satisfaction he takes in reading it aloud to his family with his finger on one word at a time. And the way he points to the main character when they ask him, "Where are you in the story?" The pride he takes in sitting next to me during bookstore readings and signing his name and writing "wow" in magic marker next to my own signature, where he creates an indelible connection with total strangers, an opportunity that because of his condition, he does not often get. All of this is proof that this medicine has powerful effects, even in extreme cases. I, I have another story to tell you. As I said, this one is about Lisa. Lisa has lived her life as a ballet dancer and as a teacher of ballet at the University of Texas in El Paso. But 4 years ago, a stroke uh, paralyzed the right side of her body. And in her case, it also resulted in aphasia. Some of you may know it's a brain condition that causes severe speech impairment. The language centers in Lisa's brain are divided from one another, and she now has difficulty completing a sentence. She's next month's guest on There's a Poem in That. The process wasn't easy for either of us. It took me many hours of careful, patient listening to allow Lisa to tell her story to the best of her ability. But talking to her reminded me that language disorders aren't confined to people on the autism spectrum. They could happen to me or you or any of us without warning at any time. And what that means to me is that we are all on the nonverbal spectrum somewhere, no matter how articulate we may think we are at the moment. Writing Lisa's poem reminded me how precariously my own creative practice balances between hemispheres. Indeed, it reminded me why I do this work in the first place, why I do the dance between my guests' experience on the one hand and my own on the other, as if my poetry practice were not, in fact, a solitary pursuit, nor a skill I possess singularly, but a mutual endeavor that hovers somewhere in a shared space, as if our common humanity were a concert hall in which one person's wow becomes everyone's wow. The poem I wrote for Lisa recognizes her calling as a performer and thanks her for the intimate dance of vulnerability she performs every minute of her life. And I won't read it to you for time, but I will encourage you to listen to the next episode. I wonder what would happen to a culture, what shift would take place if poets were trained to include this clinical modality as a component of their creative calling in the world. There are 3,000 Americans graduating from creative writing programs in the United States every year, a number that could, in the aggregate, begin to contribute significantly to the paucity of healthcare professionals. What would happen if hospitals and clinics everywhere had poets in residence or were affiliated poetry therapy clinics offering direct connections to local poets on call? I can't help it. I dream of a day when the existential meta-crisis posed by a chronically meaningless culture is met by people seeking the wisdom and perspective that poetry can offer. I dream of a day when victims of trauma, people like Lisa, will have a new reason to get up in the morning, a new lens through which to see their lives, a new truth that cuts through the doubt and the darkness, a new reason to dance. So I'll wrap up with a call to action. I really appreciate that you asked me for that. Of course, I'm going to invite you to listen to the podcast and share it, tell your healthcare providers about it, become a donor, become a guest. There's an 808 number that anyone can call. Encourage members of your family or community to become a guest. Forward this talk to others. Host me at a gathering. But beyond those obvious things, I hope you'll help me spread this message to poets and poetry lovers and those who don't yet know they're poetry lovers, that the poets of the world are standing by to demonstrate their immense capacity for open, authentic, empathic, healing work. And that's really my talk for today. I invite you to ask yourselves who in your community needs a poem in their lives the most? Where is the most dissonance in your community conversation? How could a poem enter where other modes of discourse have difficulty? Where could a poem create joy where there was sorrow, meaning where there is meaninglessness? What personal story for you most needs transforming? What collective story most needs transforming? I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, thank you very much. It's funny.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
The,
Uh,
the, the, o- the
yeah.
obvious is, how do you get into these podcasts?
Oh, I put a link in the chat for
Oh,
the
okay.
poem in that. And there are a few different things places that you can get it. Also, I put a link in the chat for Todd's overall website. Um, and it's funny, I called Todd earlier on that was it 808 number? And the answering machine has a poem. And the answering machine has a name. And I thought that's just brilliant. Um, so I love that. You brought up something where I think for a lot of people, there is some form of art that really gets to cuts through the layers of neuroses or fear that we have and just hits you right in your core. And for me, it was a Mary Oliver poem called The Summer Day. And just the simplicity of what she was talking about. And I don't want to read the the whole thing, but uh, I mean, one of the lines that has always sit with me after I first read it was, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" And it seemed like more than a question, it seemed like an admonition. And uh, it was very, very moving. Does anybody have any questions for Todd or anything, any comments other than the big one that Anthony relayed? You know,
I write a poem almost every week. I'm part of a group that gets together weekly and so forth. And I can sit down at my desk and be uninspired and no ideas, but I put pen to paper anyway. And almost always something happens. I start and then something takes over, whether it's some form of spirit or subconscious or um, deeply, undiscovered insights. It's almost like a partnership sometimes. And I wonder if you can help me and help us to better understand that and to know what to make of it. I can start a poem. I think I know what I'm going to write, and it takes me off in a direction I had not intended, and can sometimes be, at least to me, quite profound. So can you help us with that? What's going on here?
Yeah, well, far be it from me to explain where poetry comes from, but Richard, I've had that experience too, and I see some other nodding heads in the group. I attribute it to a level of trust that you have in the process that can be cultivated, and obviously, Richard, you've cultivated it. A sense that the poem itself is a teacher and that it will rise to you to do the teaching that it has to do if you let it. And that's a real skill that takes practice. But obviously you're in the right place. The goal is to let go of your own desire to teach yourself, your own wish to teach others, your own interest in expressing what you think you have to express, and just open and allow the poem to enter into a different kind of consciousness. It's a kind of meditation.
Thank you.
Don, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much. When I was sitting listening to you, I was thinking about my son who has PANS. He had PANS when he was 9, and now he's 22. And for the longest time, it was so hard. He was almost like my adversary. He was like we're trying the school and the hospitals, 9 hospital visits, 2 operations. Stanford, close to Stanford, so Stanford's was a big help. But when I was listening to you, I was thinking back to when I was thinking what's inside Chris's head and how he communicates and what's going on. And for the longest time, doctor said he probably is never going to read well or read at all, or and it was just difficult to communicate with him. But the older he got, he kind of changed, and but he was still kind of button heads and stuff. But one time the first book he read was Mice and Men, because we probably had it sitting around the house because his older brothers in high school and stuff, they had to read it. And he read the whole book, and I couldn't believe it. And he turned to my wife and said, "Are you going to take me to feed the bunnies?" And I'm like, holy smokes. Oh. He was so, God, I still get choked up, even though it was a couple of years ago. He was so aware that he was different. He was so aware that there was a struggle. And, just that word, take me to feed the bunnies, it dawned on me how he was perceiving himself and his environment. And when you're talking about words, that really just struck me. And you guys, I know that I do that anger management group for men, and he goes to it. And the second time he shared, he says, "This might not make sense to you, but it does to me." And he starts sharing, and he likes to go to it because no one interrupts him and he can talk. And thank you so much for what you do and what you said. I'm the only poetry I can remember reading being an Arab was like Kahil Gibran and stuff like that, because it's kind of forced down our throat. But words mean so much to me, and it's like thank you so much for your skill and your talent. Thank you.
Thank you, Don, and that was very moving. So thank you for relaying that. Svancha, you had a question.
Well, I had more of a comment. I was reminded of my dad, who is usually very eloquent, but and he wrote a poem about after my mother had died. He traveled to a place where they had been together before. So that was the only way he was able to describe his grief. He had never really talked about that to me, but yeah, with the poem, he could express it.
I think that's, Todd initially talked about opening up neural pathways as far as Ronan was concerned, and I think poetry and art can do that for a lot of us and make what's normally inexpressible able to be spoken. So thank you, Svancha. Carol Francis.
Yes, thank you so very much. I really love listening to your poems, reminding me that Nicaragua was called a nation of poets, because where the US would get together and go bowling, they'd get together and do poetry. Just poetry on the street, poetry. It's just really amazing. When I was teaching, there was all kinds of lesson plans for us to teach cinquain or haiku, which would drive me crazy because I'm not about counting syllables. And they never taught us, there was never a place for teaching free verse. which is what you and I both do. And I noticed in your poems, some words would rhyme totally unexpectedly, but it wasn't forced. It wasn't, oh, A, B, A, B, and all the A lines have to rhyme with it. You know, I mean, it's, so I've got this book of children. I've got all my poets, almost all my, most of my poetry is political. It's has to do with peace and justice. Some of it has absolutely nothing to do with that. And I have this book of children's poetry I wrote for children because I was teaching in Watson, Compton. And I'd love to share it. And you're talking about, excuse me, you're talking about how as children we're taught to avoid strangers and we never grow out of that. And it suddenly reminded me of this thing, this experience I had when I think it was in high school, because I took the bus 12 miles every day to and from school because it was a Catholic school. And on the buses, there are some seats that face each other. So this guy, older guy, sits down on that. And I'm looking at him because he's in front of me. Not because I'm trying to make eye contact, but looking in front of me, I see him and I look away because it's not polite to look at, you know, make that kind of eye contact with strangers. And he looks at me and same thing. And we rode for miles like that and ended up laughing. Like, are you looking at me? No, I'm not. I'm looking away. No, yeah. And it was great. We never spoke a word. I don't remember who got off the bus first, but it was such a poetic moment of communication. And I think, God, you know, there's a poem in that. I'd love to share poetry with you sometime.
That's great.
And my book of that I wrote of poetry for kids. I would love to do a workbook that goes with it that would inspire kids to explore as opposed to teach them this is how you do it. Anyway, so if you're interested in working on that.
Thank you, Carol Francis. I appreciate that.
Oh, good. Stephen, you had your hand up as well.
Yes, thank you, Todd, for being here and for being a poet. And thank you for your message this morning, your beautiful presence. Very much appreciated. I live a poet's life, primarily as a songwriter and a recording artist. But I've written a lot of poems. And I've always kind of felt that the poetry was different from the music in that it was not as outgoing. That the music and the performance and the recordings was a very outgoing kind of ambitious enterprise, whereas poetry was more deeply personal. And in a way, you talk about the private solitude of writing a poem. And that is very much what I have kind of felt the poetry to be, although more and more in my presentations, I've been, in addition to songs, I've been sharing poetry. And I would like to share a poem, short poem right now, if I may. And it's short, but I think it's relevant to what you were talking about. And it's called The Stream and the Stream Bed. Does stream define the bed? Or bed define the stream? Does dream define the person? Or person define the dream? Does mind control the senses? Or are senses to the mind like streams that flow to rivers, an ocean soon to find. Are oceans unconnected to the source where starts the stream? Is mind an unconnected source from whence appears a dream? Or are we really aiming like raindrops towards the ground, delivered from a higher source to nurture what we found? So as a poet, I've always felt that I was a receiver of a higher source in a way, if you want to put it that way. That inspiration, which means to draw in, literally to draw in spirit, was the reception process of allowing yourself to be open to the reception of that inspiration, of that divine source, which we can't really grasp, can't really define, but which we can surrender to and allow ourselves to be a palette. And that's kind of the way I've looked at it, but maybe you could expound a little bit on those thoughts that I've just brought forth.
I think it's wonderful. It reminds me what Richard was saying a little bit about that trust in something else. Yeah. When I'm at my worst as a poet, I'm not practicing that way. And when I'm at my best, I am practicing that way and I'm unaware of it. And I think you're right that I believe we're all channels of inspiration, and that this can be practiced. And what I love most about the podcast is that it's a demonstration of one person who is not trained in poetic skills attempting to find the poem in their lives, and another who is trained but doesn't know anything about this life, and that something really beautiful happens in between. And I just have the feeling, Stephen, that that's what you're talking about, this in-betweenness. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Anthony, you had your hand up.
Well, again, I just want to thank you for your amazing spirit that was present in that poem. I as I get older, my aesthetics become more simplified. I when I go to art galleries, I don't try to understand the pictures that I see, the art that I see, so much as I try to look for paintings that make me want to say, wow. And I feel the same way about poetry. I aspired to be a poet when I was young. And when I went to college, I studied poetry with Anne Sexton, which was kind of depressing because, she committed suicide, and I decided to become an academic and teach about poetry rather than write it. But over my life, I have had the experience of poems coming to me at different stages in my life. And I know what you're talking about. For me, poetry is something that comes out of a very deep place within, an inner voice, an inner awareness that's not like ordinary consciousness. So, and for me, as I'm thinking about poets who elicit that sense of wow, Mary Oliver is one of them, William Stafford, another. The sense of finding, and your poem about the deer was remarkable, not just for its imagery, but also for the sound that Carol Francis mentioned. I closed my eyes as I listened to you read, and I could just feel those beautiful consonants and vowels sort of playing together and the images coming together, but something bigger than all of that, something greater than all of those elements. Could you talk a little bit about other poets that maybe you admire or that have influenced you?
Yeah, with great admiration. I have one of the great poets that I think gave me permission to use that kind of sonic music is Kay Ryan. I don't know if that name is familiar to you, but she was poet laureate for a little while of the United States. She lives in the San Francisco Valley. Kay Ryan, Ryan. Kay writes, all of her poems could fit on a 3x5 card. They're so simple and so spare, but they pack so much. They're these dense little recipes for wonder. And usually she's taking apart a very simple concept, one that we all take for granted, and sort of finding a way to unpack it and make it mean something brand new. I just love her work. And then on the complete opposite end of the spectrum is a poet that I find completely entertaining. I'm going to quick look him up so that I'm not sure I'm not, because I get his name confused with another. Tony Hoagland is his name. Do you know Tony Hoagland's poetry?
Mm-hmm.
One of his books is called What Narcissism Means to Me. He writes these very talky, very opposite of Kay Ryan, very talky poems. He fills his poems almost like a dinner party with voices from all his friends. And they say the most outlandish things, and they have the most ridiculous points of view, but he finds a way to find the beauty and the joy in this kind of relational understanding of everyone kind of contributing to the poem.
What's that name again?
Tony Hoagland, Hoagl. I think it's A-N-D, Tony. What Narcissism Means to Me, I think, is one of his finest collections. He died of cancer maybe about 8 years ago. Just a real talent. Those are two. I could go on, but thank you for the question.
That's one of my favorite titles ever, What Narcissism Means to Me. It's like that joke of, where guys at a very narcissistic guys at a date, and he said, "But that's enough about me. Why don't you talk about me for a little bit?" So I wanted to make sure we have a good time to talk to Amy and her experiences as well. So Rose, you had your hand up as well.
And so does Ruby.
Yeah. Okay, I'll keep it short since you have more of an agenda. First of all, I loved your poem with the White Stag. It really resonated. I just want to mention that. I was going to say that I have a good friend who is a relatively well-known poet in Los Angeles, and I've been to several poetry readings for him and his friends. He's had a major tragedy, a lot of bereavements in the last few years, and every morning, I think it's every morning, I don't watch every day, he posts a little poem on Facebook. And it's incredible. They always go straight to my heart. I mean, he is so talented. But also other people are responding to it. I mean, his circle of friends. And it's just amazing to see. I have to be careful what I say because I intend to forward this video to him when it's finished. But I just thought I'd mention him. It's another outlet, another way. Thank you.
Tell us his name and where can we find him on Facebook?
Yeah, I don't know whether he can actually get into his Facebook page without being a friend. It's Mani Suri, Manisuri. Yeah. Anyway, just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's so interesting how spirit is, and my yellow hand isn't working. But Stephen, I want to thank you. Thank you so much. And also, I want to thank Richard for reminding me what I need to do, because it earlier this week, day before yesterday, we had a luncheon on with it was about France, and so I turned on the YouTube for some French music, and then after it popped off, well, my mother she was a poetess and a jazz musician, and her last award popped up there on the right after the one I turned off, and what's up I hadn't turned on, and a rabbi was there with me, so he knows I wasn't dreaming or anything. And so, Todd, I just want to thank you so much, because bringing this an ICUJP, because I need to do what I haven't been doing, is completing poems or just following through with them, which is something I need to do. My mother's telling me this. But the question I have for you, Todd, are you encouraging, or is your son, is he writing or doing any writing?
He does write. He writes rap music and posts it online like so many kids do these days. And he doesn't dare call it poetry, but I know he knows in his heart of hearts.
Yes, well, thank you. And thank you, ICUJP, again.
Oh, no, thank you. So I think Todd's going to be with us for just a little bit longer, and but I did also want to go back to one of the reasons that we wanted to. Oh, Carol Francis, did you have a quick comment? Because
very quick, I just want to say I love your wall. It's very poetic. It looks like it was designed by a poet.
This one.
Background. Yeah. Oh, good. But one of the reasons that we did want to put this talk together was not only the poetry work that Todd is doing, but also specifically about how he was moved by this one story that I linked to. And there's in the thread, the chat thread, you can see the link to the CBS News story about Ronan, who's a little kid that was very moved by this event. And Todd, I should say, I was really, when I saw the cover of your book, The Boy Who Said Wow, and I saw it was funny because there's in the seats, there's a grandfather, Ronan, and a little dog who, the dog, the kid's dog, who I'm pretty sure didn't go to the concert, but I think that's another story, is to see him and his adventure, and probably joining the orchestra. I think that'd be good. Anyway, but it did bring up the idea that what I loved about the book is what Todd talked about, is that neurodiversity and things like that don't have to be labeled. It can be, somebody that you consider quiet or detached or any number of things. And I know Amy Pringle, Reverend Amy Pringle of St. George, in the lovely community of La Cañada. If you have not been up there near the 210 freeway, it's a very, very nice place. And it's someplace really good to go. And she's done some really nice work with this, because um, she can tell you about some of the how she came to this, but it was an opportunity to be able to uh, cater to the needs of a lot of the people in her community. And I think learning about how much your perspective changes as you get deep into working with neurodiverse people is something that we can all learn from. So, Amy, if you'd like to let us know about that, the floor is yours.
Thanks, everyone. And I'll apologize in advance in case my internet connection, it seems to be kind of cutting in and out. So fingers crossed. I have come to learn more about neurodiversity because one of the ways that our church's income works is that we rent out parts of the campus. And as luck or providence would have it, in the last year or two, we've had all of these new tenants come onto campus who all serve the neurodiverse community in some way. They're therapists, they're counselors, they're tutors, educators. There's an enrichment program for homeschoolers. So we went from having a preschool on our campus, having a campus full of 3-year-old voices, to having a campus full of teenage neurodiverse people. Our preschool closed, and our campus has been completely transformed now with these older kind of middle school, high school age neurodiverse folks. And so I, of course, being the priest, said, we must do a worship service for them. But before I could do that, I needed to learn a lot more about it because I didn't know very much. I still don't know very much. I'm not here as an expert. But I learned a lot. And I'll tell you some things that I've learned this year, just so that you can have this information with you out there in the world. First, let me just buzz through some terminology. Asperger's is out. We don't use that word anymore. It's out of the diagnostic dictionary. So we just say autism now. Hans Asperger was a Nazi who killed neurodiverse children, and so we decided to stop naming things after that guy. So just autism is what we say. We don't use the term high or low functioning anymore because that's just mean. People can say that about themselves or the person in their family, but from the outside looking in, it's kind of a judgy term. People have a personal preference about whether they describe themselves as autistic or a person with autism, as on the spectrum or a person on the spectrum. That's just a personal preference thing. You're not right or wrong by using any of those terms, but it's polite to ask how they like to refer to themselves. And finally, just my own personal language preference. I prefer the word neurodiverse to neurodivergent. And that's just me being an English major, kind of a nuance of meaning there, where to me, neurodiverse is something to celebrate and that there isn't any judgment in it. But neurodivergent sounds like, oh, they've gone off the path somehow. This person is not normal in some way. So, but again, that's just me. You hear both of those words used almost interchangeably. Neurodiversity does cover really a lot of ground. It's not just autism, but it's ADHD, it's learning challenges of many kinds, dyslexia, it's people who are nonverbal for a whole host of reasons. It's sensory perception disorders like extreme sensitivity to light or sound or textures or smells. It covers really everything from, kind of mostly normal to severe conditions like cerebral palsy or irreversible conditions like dementia at the end of life. There's actually a lot of crossover between dementia and neurodiverse teenagers. And just one more kind of linguistic thing about the word neurodiversity. A phrase that I kept coming across really early in my homework is, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And you can hear what that means. There is such diversity that you can't extrapolate something that you've experienced with one person and put it onto another, because there's just the vast difference between individuals who are neurodiverse. And that brings me to the word spectrum, and that's how I'll explain the neurodiversity. When I first started doing my homework, I guess because I'd always heard the word spectrum in the singular, they are on the spectrum. What I pictured in my head was a single line or a curve or something, and you could chart people, Todd is here and Rick is here and Amy is here, and you could just put people somewhere on this line, the spectrum. But what I've learned is that it's not the spectrum. It is a spectrum of spectrums. And people are not an X on a line. They're a constellation. And I'll just quickly share. So this is very basic. It's not complete in any way. It's just to give you a sense. So most neurodiverse people have some measure of social anxiety, some measure of challenge with executive function, sensory avoidance or sensitive seeking, verbal expression, written expression, physical expression. If this were a person, this would be one individual's chart. Another person would have X's in a different place. And as I say, the chart is very basic, just to kind of give you the sense of what we mean by spectrum of spectrums and diversity. Everyone has their own kind of combination of issues. And just as we have found out in this group that sit with any group of people for 10 minutes and you'll realize that half of them are poets. Sit with any group of people for 10 minutes and you'll realize that half of them are neurodiverse, or perhaps more. When I first started reading about it, kind of the hair on the back of my neck went up, and I thought, oh, some of this is sounding really familiar to me. And I even went online and tested myself to see because I'm old enough that I wouldn't have been diagnosed at a young age. I was not, but I definitely have my places on that chart. I cannot stand LED headlights. I mean, they really bother me. So, everyone has their thing. So I'm going to keep saying like they to describe neurodiverse people, but that's not really accurate. Really, all of us have some measure of some things that are about neurodiverse people. Putting people on a chart like that, describing their symptoms as in things that need to be fixed about them, is of course wrong. that is, and it's misleading, and it isn't really a good way to describe someone with neurodiversity, because it leaves off a whole host of strengths that they have that other people may not. If you haven't heard the list before of people who have been diagnosed in the present or backwardly diagnosed in history as neurodiverse, let me just buzz through some names for you to get a sense of giftedness. Listen for giftedness and think, what if our world had not had these neurodiverse people? Albert Einstein, Steve Jobs, Tim Burton, Greta Thunberg, Dan Aykroyd, Charles Darwin, Bill Gates, Robin Williams, Michelangelo, Anthony Hopkins, Thomas Jefferson, Bobby Fischer. The list goes on and on. There is a giftedness that neurodiverse people bring to the world that our world would not be the same without. And so to think of neurodiversity as a problem that needs to be fixed is not only an injustice, it's incorrect. And I guess this connects with some of the things that Todd said. What my experience has been so far, my learning has been so far, is that there's a kind of oppression of the verbal world. There's to say that the only way to relate, the only way to be social, the only way to have a relationship is verbally, is there's it's oppressive, and again, it's incorrect. Think about when the family dog dies, the level of grief that you have is as if you have lost a family member, and indeed you have. The dog was not verbal. The dog could not be verbal, and yet they were a member of your family. So we need to honor this sort of second level of relationship that can happen past verbalness. It reminds me of that saying from Rumi that I'm fond of quoting. Rumi has that great saying, out beyond right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. There's this kind of next level of humanness that can happen without words. And that's where a lot of relationships with neurodiverse people can happen. And one more thing that I'll say about kind of the verbalness, because that is a challenge for a lot of people to try to have a relationship with someone who's neurodiverse when they don't speak very much or very often. The explanation that I came across that's really stuck with me about this, and I hope it's helpful for you too, is that, for example, you can say to a neurodiverse person, "Oh, look, isn't that tree over there pretty?" Some of us would kind of do a quick glance over and give you a cheap yes, it's pretty. A neurodiverse person will take that question with utmost seriousness, and they will want to answer that question to the best of their ability. And know that as they're sitting there being nonverbal and not saying anything, and perhaps not even looking at the tree, what could be going through their head is this: what does the word pretty really mean? Are you asking if it's pretty for a tree, or pretty compared to a diamond, or to my mom, or to a beluga whale? Is it prettier than the other trees around it? Is it pretty only because of this time of year or this angle of the sun? Why do we call them trees? Do other planets have trees? Do those trees have chlorophyll? I wonder what color trees are on other planets. As they're sitting there being nonverbal with a flat affect on their face and looking like they're not engaging with you at all, what's happening in them is 1,000 ways to entertain your question. And the problem is that they're not verbal, but that by the time they're ready to really answer your question in a way that feels legitimate to them, like I'm now ready with a real answer for you, you've given up on them and you're talking about something else. So a lot of the nonverbalness is a recognition that your level of verbal communication it's just not running at the same speed that theirs is. I stuttered badly when I was a little kid, really badly for a lot of years. And the way that it always felt to me is that my mind worked too fast for my mouth.
Oh.
I couldn't make my mouth work fast enough to say what was in my mind. And that's the way I kind of connect and relate with neurodiverse people. It can look from the outside like nothing's going on, and the opposite is true. The opposite is that there's a million things going on, and their mouth can't keep up, or perhaps they know that you can't keep up with the million things. that are happening in their mind. I'll talk about just one more thing. I know we're kind of, running up against time, but one more thing that I've learned, and this kind of touches now into the issues of justice. There's a term called masking, which is what it sounds like. Neurodiversity isn't a static thing. People can learn skills as they go through life. They can make progress in certain areas, and the reason that you see neurodiversity or speak of it more in children than adults is that you can learn to get up to a level where you can relate to other people and kind of function in normal society. I mean, I was surprised to hear about Thomas Jefferson, right? So they learn these masking skills. They know how to act normal. They know how to function in a neuro unified world. But they're at a point in history, neurodiversity is at a point in history where rightly it is saying, okay, I could do that, but why should I? Like women who had to act like men, like Black people who had to act like they were white. There's all of these fields of differences go through a kind of plottable history where at the beginning they have to pretend that they're like everyone else. And at some point they say, wait a minute, stop the bus. I have something to offer all by myself that is from my place of difference that could be helpful and good in the world. And my masking, my pretending to be something different than who I am, isn't going to let that happen. So let me offer what I have to offer, coming from exactly who I am and how I am, because that's how I can change things. That's how I can contribute to the world. That's how I can be Michelangelo. So where we stand right now, as near as I can have learned, is in the field of neurodiversity, is to let neurodiverse people be neurodiverse, to accept that, to honor that, to welcome it, to celebrate it, as we would celebrate any other culture, that there are beautiful things to come from those differences. So should you come face to face with a neurodiverse person and be feeling awkward? I don't know what to say. I don't know how to handle this. I'm not sure how to carry myself. The thing to ask yourself is, what does this person have to offer the world? And how could they, in fact, in the next 5 minutes, make me a better person? So I'll stop off there and take any questions.
Uh-huh. Thank you, Amy. That was it's very powerful, and just from hearing your experience and how you were able to learn how to um, essentially sublimate your own ego to a certain extent and your own you know knowledge about how you've been able to communicate before and be able to modify that for um, communicating with a broader group of people. That's pretty powerful. Zvancha, you had your hand up.
Yes, I had another perspective on the symptoms. Um, that chart of the symptoms can be helpful if somebody like doesn't want to have that symptom. Like, it's not fun to have social anxiety, and that support can be offered. So yeah, if you want to alleviate that symptom, then something like that chart can be very helpful.
Thank you. Don, yeah, you had a short comment.
Very short. in your studies, do you find or that like my son Christopher has a very high EQ. He's very in tune with his surroundings and very in tune. Well, in my work is I've discovered 80, 90% of communication is nonverbal. Do you find out with high functioning or people like my son Chris that they do have a high EQ, they know what's going on, and they're very in touch with their emotions, even though
Yes.
they might not communicate that?
Yes, absolutely. Matter of fact, I would say, again, because there's a flat affect on the face, we have been trained to read that as that person is not emotional. But again, what's happening in them is it's either 1,000 emotions or it's one emotion that is incredibly intense. And they've learned, you know, we learn at a very early age what isn't okay about us, right? And they've learned if I express this incredibly intense emotion, it's people won't appreciate it. People won't understand it. They'll look at me funny. I'll feel funny. So they've just learned to go silent with it because because something or other about the world has trained into them that that level of emotion, that intensity of emotion isn't okay. Or that intensity of interest. I mean, another hallmark of neurodiversity is that they will drill down on one particular subject which fascinates them. And if you want to talk to them, you know, you have to ask about Han Solo because Han Solo is their guy. They can tell you everything in the world about Han Solo, but you know, but if you ask them about something else, they'll be silent because they don't know everything about whatever it is you ask about. So yeah, there's absolutely a not only a breadth of emotion, but a depth of emotion that again is it's mismatched to the world, which is different from saying it's not there.
Very true. Carol Francis, you had your hand up. You had a very quick comment.
Yeah, is Rain Man accurate? Is that one, or what movies have been
Um,
accurate?
I'm not qualified to say. But Rain Man is um yeah, I think it's accurate. I think that that kind of focus on a particular thing, you know, his was the weather and that insistence on, you know, at this time of day I have to tune into this or
Mm,
like or I will explode.
Yeah.
There's a need for that kind of predictability and sameness to a schedule that is a hallmark of neurodiversity. So um, I don't think it's necessarily accurate in the terms of expecting every neurodiverse person to be a savant about something.
mm,
That's, you know, there's kind of a backward injustice in saying, you know, oh, you're neurodiverse, you have to be a Bill Gates, you have to be Michelangelo. Um, you know,
mm,
so sometimes they're just normal people and not a savant about something.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's probably as accurate as any Hollywood film portrayed by a non-diverse actor would
mhm,
probably be, right? Let me do this too. There is, I put in the chat some resources that I got from a few different people, and that's in the shared drive. You'll be able to print that out if you need. There are regional centers that you can take a look at for various parts of LA County. Um, I didn't know the statistic. An estimated 40%, 49% of children with autism will engage in wandering behavior. So prevention and planning is key. That's something. LA Found is another group that is working along those lines. And this is from Kate Minos, who works a lot with law enforcement and interacting with them on how to work with neurodivergent people. There's some great resources for various groups around LA and also larger groups and that work in the US. So,
Yeah,
Amy,
one more characteristic to know is that often neurodiverse people don't have the same sense of danger
mm-hmm.
that others have. So, we have at church, because we had a preschool, we have playground equipment, and we have to be really careful of the neurodivergent kids because they don't perceive danger in the same way, and they could stick their heads through the railing of something and get stuck, and that's something you really have to keep an eye on. And so in an emergency, first responders know that there's this challenge of trying to explain to them that there is a danger and they must move because they don't. You'd think the house is on fire, everyone knows to get out, but that isn't necessarily true. So that is a challenge.
Mhm. Yeah, so all of these things are need to be considered. So yeah, Amy, thank you very much. This was uh, very informative and very moving, to see how how you've had to adapt to that too. Um, so
Ruby has her hand up.
oh, Ruby, yeah, the very quick question. We're running up on
Yeah,
time.
I just want to thank you for all the information you gave me. Thank you. And I have a quick cast. I have a friend, her father was in a car accident 5 years ago. And everybody he meets, he has to start the conversation with that and then talk about everything he's gone through. Would that be a person that would be into neurodiversity?
Yes, yeah. Any form of brain damage also qualifies as neurodiversity. If you haven't seen the movie Regarding Henry, watch it. It's an amazing movie, one of my favorites. But yeah, as I say, there's an incredible crossover between the oldest adults in our congregation who are dealing with, various degrees of dementia and these youngest people who are neurodiverse.
Mhm.
And I guess just to end on a poetic note in Todd's honor, um, I'm enough of a poet that I was invited to a couple of art salons where um, there's there are people making music at the same time that there's someone over there painting, and I was sitting up in front of people composing poetry, and it was, people creating their art in that moment. And what would happen is people who came to the salon at the beginning, everyone introduces themselves, and they would just say, "What are you hoping for lately?" And everyone would say something that they were hoping for, and then we would all create our art based on kind of the what the whole room had said about things they were hoping for, and it completely changed my poetry. What I wrote was really a new genre from what I had, kind of the self-absorbed stuff that I had been writing. And now, even when I'm writing by myself, I remind myself to kind of be in that space, to think about, you know, listen to the silence of the hearts around me, and and that practice is what has enabled me to be with neurodiverse people, who either aren't verbal or they're not verbal fast enough to have a conversation. But listening to the silence of hearts is that's a pretty good skill, and it's a pretty good practice in justice issues as well.
Yeah. So I wanted to thank both of our guests today because I think I had a hard time trying to put this into one or two sentences on the invite, and I think it actually dovetailed really well. Uh, so, Todd, thank you very much for your work. Amy, it was good, very good to meet you. I'm sure that you're going to have a lot of people um, that'll, well, we should be visiting La Cañada because, like I said, it's very pretty. Um,